Sup everyone, it's your boy Walt, and I finally finished Engage on Maddening without using the time crystal. And oh boy, do I have a lot to say regarding this game. But before I go into its gameplay in some later videos, I want to make a couple videos regarding its story. And what better place to start than at the beginning? The beginning of any story is extremely important, especially in video games. It's probably the most important point where you need to hook the player in, as it's at this point when someone decides whether the rest of your game, or on a grander scale, series, is worth engaging with or not. So I want to take it a bit further than just talking about Engage's beginning. I want to talk about all of the modern Fire Emblem games' intro sequence, and then at the end of the video, I'll see how Engage stacks up against them. By modern Fire Emblem, I mean Awakening onwards. To clarify, this is just covering the small sequence at the beginning of each game where they for the most part flash forward, though sometimes flash back, to a completely different point in the story. Sometimes there'll be gameplay, but sometimes it's just a cutscene. To be more specific, I'll be covering the Premonition of Awakening, the Prologue of Fates, the very first cutscene of Echoes, the very first cutscene of Three Houses, and then Engage's prologue. I know Echoes technically flashes forward and then flashes back, but for the sake of consistency, I'm just going to talk about that first cutscene. Now, I'm going to judge these intros based on two factors. The hook, how well it captures a player's interest to see how things play out, and the payoff, how well the intro fits within the grander context of the story, and how much it bolsters the narratives and themes. But there are a few caveats. I'm not going to go into how these intros establish the characters, the setting, and the tone. While it's important for the beginning of a story to do that, that really isn't the focus of these intro sequences. That focus is passed on to whatever directly precedes them. Like for example, the prologue that happens right after the scene we will be discussing in Echoes establishes all of those things. These intros, while they can set things up for later in the story, are primarily just cool little sparks of events that kick off the story with a bang. Also, for the sake of fairness, I'm not going to completely judge the intros alone based on their payoffs, as it's not really the intro's job to pay itself off, that's really the job of the rest of the plot. But I still really want to talk about how these intros fit in within the full context of their respective narrative. So keep in mind when it comes to payoff, I'm mostly judging the plot that revolves around these intros and what that leads to, rather than the intros themselves. But I still feel that it is fair to take off a couple of points, as while it may not be the intro's fault, they can still be made retroactively worse based on what precedes them. Also, of course, this is all my opinion. If you have a different point of view, feel free to post it in the comments, as I love discussing things like this. Now before we begin, some housekeeping. I know Engage is kind of losing relevance at this point, the internet is moving on to other things. I don't blame it, as I also want to really move on from Engage at this point, but regardless, I am passionate about making this video, and there are 4 others I want to make in relation to Engage before I'm done. So, if you guys really enjoy this in comparison to my usual content, let me know by leaving a like, comment, or subscribing. The benchmark I'll use is if this video gets either 1,000 views, 50 likes, or 10 different people comment on it, I may consider making more videos like this or talking about Engage even further. Anyway, without further ado, let's begin. I'm going to start with Three Houses, since that one is a bit of the odd one out in terms of these intros, as it's the only one that starts with a flashback rather than flashing forward. I really don't have much to say about this intro besides the fact that it's good. Not great, but a solid A-B+ type intro. This cutscene is beautifully animated, and seeing the two armies go at each other just looks so cool. But the part that really sticks out is when Saros just starts stabbing Nemesis like an insane person. You can just feel the pure rage and lust for revenge with each stab, and the relief she feels when she tells her mother she finally carried out her revenge.
You'll die! 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 You took everything that I loved! He's gone now, Mother.
Now, without even knowing who these characters are or what is even going on, there's already some emotional drama a player can latch onto. What did this guy do to make her hate him so much? And how did his actions impact the tragedy that most likely befell her mother? So the hook is excellent, but what about the payoff? Well, in the grander context of the narrative, the intro paid off quite well, assuming you pick the Golden Deer route. On this route, Rhea expands on what happened, finally answering those questions the player had in the back of their mind throughout the game. Plus, we even get to fight Nemesis as the final boss, bringing things full circle. The issue is, you only get closure from this plot thread in the Golden Deer route. It's kind of dropped and forgotten about in the other routes, so the payoff on this intro loses a couple of points because of that. Now, on to Fates, and oh boy do I have a lot to say about Fates' intro. So the start isn't too bad. We see Azura going into the water, which is intriguing.
You are the ocean's gray waves, destined to seek life beyond the shore, just out of reach. Yet the waters ever change, flowing like time, the path is yours to climb.
Then, we see the war between Hoshido and Nor in a cutscene that still looks good to this day. And then, oh my goodness. We see our protagonist Corrin struggling against what's basically the Goomba of the Fire Emblem series, the Axe Fighter. Now, this isn't inherently a bad thing. A lot of people love those zero to hero RPGs where your character struggles fighting a snail, but by the end you can fight God. But the problem here is it's very clear this event is taking place in a later portion of the narrative, so seeing our protagonist still struggle against the most basic enemy in the series is not the best introduction to the character. But it could have been way worse, like a certain someone who's supposed to be a seasoned mercenary needing plot armor to not get killed by a Fire Emblem Goomba. But I'm getting a bit off track here. Anyway, we get a very basic tutorial. Now admittedly, seeing all of these units from the two nations on the map at once is very hype, but it's not really enough to save this intro. As after the tutorial, we have all the royal siblings having a hissy fight about Corrin. Now, there are two major flaws with this intro's hook. For one, we already knew Corrin was going to need to choose between his birth family and the family that raised him. It was all over to marketing. So this intro is just giving us information that we already know. But let's assume that you hadn't seen any of the marketing and know absolutely nothing about this game. Even then, I'd say the hook fails for the most part. For one, the dialogue is very campy that it's hard to take what's going on seriously. The setup is also a bit absurd and does not feel natural at all, as these two families are basically having a hissy fight in the middle of a huge battle. Also, maybe it's because of the campy dialogue or the silly setup, but I personally find in general, there's nothing interesting enough that happens that really would get someone invested. I know the question the writers want the player to ask are, why do these people hate each other, and why are they all obsessed with Corrin? But due to what I explained before, I find it difficult to care. Though even with all of this working against this intro's hook, it honestly doesn't have the worst hook in the world, and I could see nuggets that would intrigue the player to see how things got to this point. But the payoff of this intro is absolutely garbage. In the grander context of the narrative, this intro sequence does not need to exist. For one thing, I really don't like the framing trope of "it was all a dream," as it's something that adds less narrative weight to what happened within that dream and takes someone out of the story. But the major problem is that when you get back to this part of the story, the exact same events play out, and then you make the big choice and the game moves on. Now, you could argue the choice is the payoff, but no, I'd say it's just the payoff to the scene right before it. This means that this intro did not need to exist at all. It's completely redundant and just wastes the player's time. If it was removed from the game, nothing of value would be lost. In fact, even the developers thought this. That's why they let you skip it with the Branch of Fate option. So this intro has no reason to exist. Well, I guess the Azura going into the water section is revealed later to not be a metaphor or symbolic of anything, and was the actual literal way to get to the land of Vala. But that's a can of worms I am not going to open today. Perhaps the thought process behind this intro was, oh, Awakening had an intro where they flash forward, and Awakening saved the franchise, so let's just do that again. But they failed to realize what made Awakening's intro so great in the first place, which we'll get to. But first, speaking of following trends, Echoes also had a flash forward sequence for its intro. Though to be fair, it's just a cutscene this time, not a gameplay sequence. Now, the hook in this intro is quite good. Seeing Celica supposedly be killed by Alm can be quite shocking for fans of Gaiden, as that never happened in the original Gaiden. But even if you haven't played Gaiden and once again know absolutely nothing about this game, there's immediate intrigue on what caused these two to fight to the death, especially considering this guy seems to really care about the girl he just killed. The voice actor does an amazing job here, as you can just feel the anguish in his voice as he screams her name.
Celica! Celica! Say something, please! Celica!
So yeah, there's already an emotional investment in what caused these two people who liked each other to fight. The hook is excellent. But when put into full context with the story, that's where the intro falls very flat. For when we get back to this point in the plot, we find out they are fighting because Celica's possessed by Duma. That's much less interesting than them having an actual interpersonal conflict and fighting over that. And then, when Celica quote-unquote dies, she is immediately brought back to life. And I don't care that there's an explanation, like the power of Falchion or Millet did it or whatever. The point is, all emotional investment the scene once had completely vanishes with the full context. There's absolutely no consequence to Celica dying if she's brought back to life immediately after. Thus, the plot point becomes completely pointless, and by proxy, the intro also becomes completely pointless. So while this intro also has no reason to exist, I still think it's better than the Fates intro, as at least it hooks the player in. Kind of like a clickbaity YouTube video that has a good thumbnail, but the actual video is terrible. Now, let's get to the game that started the trend of flash-forward intros, Awakening. And this intro, it is perfect. We're immediately thrust into the action as we see Robin and Chrom battle Valadar. I especially like how the camera moves and shakes to make us really feel like we're seeing things from Robin's perspective. But anyway, we get a quick tutorial section, they defeat Valadar, it seems like things worked out. But then...
This isn't over! Damn you both! You alright? That's the end of him. Thanks to you, we carried the day. We can rest easy now.
At long last. What's wrong? Hey,
This is not your fault. Promise me you'll escape from this place. Please, go.
Now, I don't even need to imagine what a new person who knows absolutely nothing about this game or series would be thinking, as I was that person. This was my first Fire Emblem game after all, and I really put myself into the player avatar Robin's shoes when I first played it. So immediately, thoughts flew through my head like, why would I kill the main good guy? What happened that would set me down this path of darkness? And why does it seem like the main good guy doesn't blame me for killing him? I absolutely had to know. I was hooked. But what's truly amazing about this intro is revealed once the context is added. First of all, there's actually some different ways to interpret how this intro fits into the plot. Now, canonically, this intro is probably just a dream sequence. That's what it says in the official wiki, the game starts with Robin waking up, and Basilo even states it right here. However, that is not definitive proof. On subsequent playthroughs, I realized that this intro may not be a flash-forward sequence at all, but in fact, the actual beginning of the story. This intro could in fact be taking place within Lucina's original timeline. Thus, we are seeing the inciting incident that threw Lucina's timeline into chaos. Which means this all would happen before Lucina traveled to the main timeline that the rest of the story takes place in. Thus, technically, it would be the first thing that happens, which is so cool. But regardless of whether this is just a dream, the beginning of Lucina's timeline being destroyed, or both, it still works. After all, this intro sequence is labeled as the premonition. And what is the definition of a premonition? It's a strong feeling something's about to happen, especially something unpleasant. In other words, a looming fate, an impending omen, a destiny that is rapidly approaching, and in a sense, The entire narrative and themes of the game revolve around this premonition. One of the main themes of the game is not being bound to fate. No matter how dire things seem or how out of control you feel your life is, you always have the power to shape your own destiny. Very cliche, admittedly, but I feel it's executed well here. Throughout the game, we see that Lucina coming to the new timeline and trying to change what happens doesn't do much. It's true that the way things happen is altered a bit, but the outcome is still the same. No matter what our heroes do, the paths of fate seem to correct itself and still circle back to the same point. So Robin dreaming about this occurring, and seeing how everything throughout the story is playing out, there's quite a lot of tension on whether they can overcome this pivotal moment. After all, they weren't able to alter destiny yet despite their best efforts, so why would that moment be any different? So once we arrive back at this intro, this premonition, this pivotal moment, we see things play out in the exact same way. Unlike in Fates or Echoes though, there's a clear purpose to the events playing out in the exact same way. It connects to the themes of destiny, and also builds tension, as because nothing changed, it would seem that Valadar is right. Maybe there really is no way to alter destiny. What's already written cannot be undone. So at the last moment when it's revealed Robin was able to outsmart and truly alter destiny, it is just that much more gratifying. A moment that felt earned thanks to the setup provided by this absolutely perfect intro. 10 out of 10, chef's kiss. Mwah. And finally, we come full circle to engage. The intro is pretty good. We get a really cool cutscene of all the characters fighting corrupted, then we have a quick tutorial sequence, and then the point of intrigue is introduced. Marth's line right here.
Know that I will always be with you, and that we will stand together again, as we did this day. If ever we cross paths again, I hope you will remember me.
What does Marth mean by, we will stand together again? And also, why would he say, I hope you'll remember me? How does he know that Alir will forget him? And how does he know there will be another world-ending conflict that would make him and Alir need to team up again? Perhaps it didn't get me emotionally invested, but it certainly piqued my curiosity. Thus, I'd say the intro is quite successful as a hook. Now, how it fits in within the grander context of the narrative, I'm not entirely sure. At first, I thought this intro sequence was the event that took place 1,000 years ago when Sombron was defeated. But that can't be, as later in the game we see 1,000 years ago that Alir is still evil Alir, and he fails to kill Sombron. He almost kills him, but then he gets shot through the chest with a laser beam, and doesn't die for some reason, he just has to sleep it off, which is admittedly kinda dumb. And then Lumera is the one who defeats Sombron, so this intro sequence is most likely a dream. After all, the scene right after is Alir waking up from his 1,000-year sleep. Now, this intro does lose a couple of points for just being a dream, but I still wouldn't put it in the same tier as Fates and Echoes intro for a couple of reasons. For one thing, this intro scene does not repeat again, so it avoids being redundant. This scene also bolsters the themes of the game. Granted, the themes in this game are quite cliche, just power friendship mumbo jumbo. Even so, we see characters work together to defeat Sombron, so functionally, it works. This intro in the grander context of the narrative. I believe its purpose was to misdirect the player. The writers wanted you to think this intro is a flash-forward sequence so that the player would think that these were the events that transpired 1,000 years ago. That way, they can subvert your expectations later when it's revealed Alir is the Fell Dragon's child. You could argue that this makes little sense as they also show a scene of evil Alir early on, but I'd argue that's there just to keep the player guessing. Now, if this misdirection was the writer's intention, then I'd say this intro works pretty well. But I could also be looking into things too much, and in reality, this intro is actually just a shallow contrivance created to justify a tutorial that can serve as nothing more than a plot hole in a narrative. Or a lazy callback to the 3DS flash-forward sequences. At the end of the day, I'm just not sure. Well, that's the end of the video. I'm out of here. Peace.